Hi, Steve and Caleb with Brownells here, and today we're going to take a look at another firearm that you should have spare parts on hand for. And today, it's the mighty AR-15. What do you think? What should we have?
So there's really only two main components that are going to wear out through normal use. And there's tests to check and see if they're worn out or not, and that is the gas rings and the buffer spring.
Okay, yeah.
But most of the other springs in there, trigger spring, hammer spring, mag catch spring, bolt catch spring, those will pretty much never wear out. It's not a bad idea to have some extras on hand just in case. But you'll more than likely never have to change them, but it's better safe than sorry.
It's almost like it was designed not to need a lot of spare parts.
Exactly. So here we're taking a look at two different ARs. We have the standard one with standard parts in it, more mil-spec parts, and then we have one with a, I guess we'll call it more aftermarket parts.
Oh, boutique parts.
Boutique parts,
Yeah.
Excellent.
Nice.
So let's get started with the standard. So open this one up here. Of course, you have your bolt carrier group. Now, as far as the bolt carrier group itself goes, you can just have an extra one of these on hand as well.
Right.
Rather than having to change all the individual parts. Unless you have one of these, there's that term again, boutique bolt carrier groups, in which case you'll just want to change the internal parts.
Sure.
Rather than taking this one apart, I'll just show you on here because this one's already disassembled and it is exactly the same.
Well, what breaks on these things?
So really, like I said before, the only thing that's really going to wear out is the gas rings. You'll have to change those, and it's just a matter of taking a small flathead screwdriver, peeling them off, putting the new ones back on, and of course the gap on it doesn't matter. They can be aligned. They don't.
I think we busted that myth a long time ago.
We nailed that one.
Busted that Smith.
There we go. So the extractor itself, it's a good idea to have another extractor spring, extractor pin on hand.
That's a high wear, that part takes a beating.
It does take a beating. They almost never break, but it is a possibility because of all the use and of course the beating it takes.
Right. Now if you've got a full auto, like an M16 or something, if you've got a class 3 gun, then these bolts really take a beating. You should have a whole spare bolt actually.
Yeah.
It's not unknown to break off a lug and all kinds of bad things happen.
Yep, absolutely. But typically if you have one of the O-rings around your extractor spring as well, those pretty much last forever under normal non-full auto type use. And that's really it for the bolts.
Is it fair to say that the shorter the barrel, the more this wears? The more the parts get beaten up, the extractor and stuff?
Yes, because typically the shorter the barrel, the more gas it's getting.
With the more pressure it's extracting under.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So if you're shooting a 20 or 24-inch barrel, these parts will probably last you the rest of your life.
Yeah. Yep, that's a fair statement for sure. The bolt carrier itself, again, nothing's going to wear out on this. The gas key's staked. That should never come loose. You should never have to take those screws off unless for whatever reason it does come loose.
And you can restake it and retighten it if it does come loose.
You can. Yep, absolutely.
Now, I've seen them damaged from being dropped.
Yeah.
They take a dent.
That'll get bent.
And really put a new key on if that happens.
Yeah, it's usually if you try to switch them out and fix them, they'll get a crack in them. And
yeah.
It's not
hard
worth
stuff.
It. Now another part's the cotter pin.
You can put it right down.
Yep. That's one you should have how many of?
Oh, I would have at least 3 or 4 laying around because that is so easy to lose when you do just regular maintenance on the gun that it's just so handy to grab one. The ones down at the hardware store don't work. They're too soft. They last a couple rounds and then they just start to bend and break. So you really need a good quality one. And they're cheap, so why not?
Yeah, and what about the cam pin?
Every once in a while you'll see one cracked right through the middle, right where the hole is, but not often, not often. You could lose it easier than you could break it, really.
And this is a part that everyone seems to get a spare of, but never really needs.
No, that firing pin does not seem to wear out. I've never been able to wear one out. I mean, I've seen it done on military guns where they're shot cycle after cycle after cycle, of troops coming through and training. But as far as, boy, I don't know how many rounds it would take to wear one out. Again, unless you've got a full auto M16 type, a class 3 weapon, then your firing pin may take a more of a beating. All these parts will take more of a beating. They're a little more high maintenance.
Yeah, and typically where they will wear out is not necessarily the tip, but on this back side here, because that's actually part of the gas system.
Yeah.
So on your full auto guns, that's a possibility.
And I'm not sure if it's the rapidity of the cycling or if it's just the number of rounds that go through it or the amount of heat that's allowed to build up, but full auto is tough on guns. So that takes care of the upper. What about the lower half?
Yeah, so moving on to the lower, and the charging handle is, you're most likely never going to have to change that as well.
Well, I've seen guys kick the charging handle trying to get a stuck round out.
Yeah.
If you're doing that, yeah, get a spare one. But otherwise, if you're acting normal, you won't need one.
And for the lower, your takedown pins, if you're never going to remove those, probably not an issue. But it's always a good idea just to have an extra spring and detent. Aero Precision sells their, I think they call it their Oops kit, and that has a bunch of extra parts in it, and those are really handy just to have on hand. The hammer and trigger spring, almost never have to replace them, but they're so cheap, why not have one on hand? It's one of those types of situations.
If you have some kind of lower poundage spring on your hammer, it might be worth it just to have a stock one around in case all of a sudden you start getting misfires and you need to shoot a match the next day or something. Just put a stock spring in there and you're fine until you get things figured out. Like you said, they're cheap.
Yeah, and also if you're limited to some of the imported ammunition with the hard primers, get an extra power hammer spring.
Exactly.
And that'll improve your reliability there. And at the beginning, another part I mentioned was the buffer spring. So we'll take a look at that here. Now, the buffer spring, the only way to tell if that's worn out is to measure the length. Okay. So there's a serviceable range between them. The minimum is going to be 10 and 1/16 inches. So if it's below that, then you should replace it.
For a carbine?
For a carbine.
Okay.
Rifle spring, I think, is 11 1/4 minimum serviceable length.
It'd have to be, about the length of that spacer would be the difference. You know, the spacers that come with some of the, so you can use it in either stock.
Exactly.
What about the buffer itself? You ever seen one wear out?
The only time these really get worn out is, again, on the full auto guns. You'll see the pad on the bottom start to kind of flatten out and mushroom a bit.
That's not surprising.
And you can replace just that, but buffers are typically really inexpensive. And
for a stock buffer.
For a stock buffer.
If you're doing a heavy buffer or something, they get a little pricey.
Yeah, so on those you can just replace the buffer or the bumper on the back. But the face of it, if you're running an overgas gun, this is a H buffer, but you'll notice that the bolts cuts that ring into the face of it.
Sure.
And that can be an issue, but if you're running if your gas is well regulated in your AR-15, it's not an issue. And that's really it for the buffer itself.
Well, other than that, in the lower, there's not much to go wrong unless you lose parts, changing a pistol grip out or something and your selector spring and detent drop out. I mean, it doesn't hurt to have spare detents and springs around for any firearm you own, really.
Yep, exactly. And that's exactly it. So pretty.
But as far as the bolt stop, the magazine catch, your takedown pin and pivot pin, they just don't wear out. I mean, you don't really need spares of those hanging around.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's really it for the lower. Now on some of your more boutique customized AR-15s, you don't really have all those options. One thing I will say is that, for example, like this one, I have a lot of aftermarket parts in it. So we'll take a look here.
While he's doing that, if you install a self-contained trigger, like a Timney or Chip McCormick or something, don't sell your old parts. Keep those on hand in case something happens to that new trigger down the road. If you break apart or something on it, put your originals back in so the gun still functions.
Exactly. And so here, what we're working with, of course, this trigger is not a standard trigger. It's a Elfman trigger. And if you want to have something on hand, just have a standard mil-spec trigger on hand.
Yeah.
Not that I'm expecting this one to break, but of course,
no.
it's just good to have.
We don't get very many returns on the contained triggers.
Yeah, not
the
at all.
module trigger is what I want to say.
And then, of course, aftermarket buffer and spring, like this Geisley Super 42. Again, this is designed to be more reliable than the standard one. But again, it's good to have both just in case.
You went all out on this one.
I certainly did. So on top of all those spare parts, just have a few tools to be able to take them apart, especially if you're running aftermarket parts. Make sure you have the tools to remove them if needed
Right.
and service them. But that's basically it.
Other than spare batteries for your optics or
Of course,
lights or
yeah.
whatever, I mean, that's it.
Yeah, there's a lot of parts, but they're pretty, we covered a lot, but they're low maintenance.
Yeah.
So if you have anything you want to add to this, or of course if you have anything you want us to cover that we haven't covered, feel free to leave us a comment down below.
Right, and if there's a spare part you've had to reorder time and time again because it either breaks or you lose it, tell us what it is.
Yeah.
We'll add it to the list if it's not already on there.
Yep, absolutely. So feel free to give us a call on the tech line if you have any questions. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.